We're going to go ahead and get started. In dealing with policy and compliance management, we are basically talking about the concept of complying with requirements. That's really all that it is in a small nutshell. Policy and compliance management provides for that type of process in several different ways. So first thing we have is a centralized process for putting your policies, your standards, your internal controls, your best practices in one place. Instead of using SharePoint or Confluence for different things, you're going to put all of that into ServiceNow. And that's the internal side of compliance. Internal policies are the way we do things here at the enterprise. According to our industry, our business, we do it this way. Those standards, those internal control procedures, those best practices, those are all internal. But when we think of compliance, we're not just thinking internal, but external as well. There are external regulations that come from regulatory bodies across the globe. When we deal with a client, the first question when it comes to policy and compliance management is, what regulatory sources do you have to worry about? For an American company that provides services in America or in North America, that could be the federal government. It could be a state and local government for their state, like New York. It could be a regulatory body like ISO. It could be the IRS. It could be the standards for credit card transactions, PCC DSS. There are regulatory bodies that put out regulations and best practices all the time. For an international organization, that's where it gets really crazy, because then you're talking about looking at not just the federal government here in the United States and state and local government regulations. You're also including national regulations across the globe, such as the Spanish royal decrees. When you talk about national bodies, you're talking about the EU, such as GDPR, the global data privacy regulations for businesses doing business in the EU and businesses that provide services to the EU. So as an American company, if I provide services across the globe, including parts of the EU, if I have more than 2,000 potential customers, I fall into GDPR and I have to comply with GDPR. California recently put out a new privacy act, the California Consumer Privacy Act, which is like the EU's GDPR, but goes even further. So if you do business in California, whether you're an international company and you want to do business there, or an American company, you want to do business, you have that to deal with. So these are a cross-mapping of external regulations and best practices to the internal policies. The EU says we have to do X. In our business, we do X by doing X, Y, and Z. That's policy and standard to external regulation. Policy compliance also provides several workflows behind the scenes to both identify entities in ServiceNow that need to be kept compliant, assess them on a regular basis, and monitor them continuously on a regular schedule automatically without having to do anything. These workflows provide for a lot of automation. And again, the goal of policy compliance, much like risk, is to get your compliance admins, your process admins, out of the weeds of daily processing and into an oversight role. And you want compliance to move to the desktop. Operational compliance at the desktop level. That's the goal of policy compliance in GRC. It also provides for an integration point with Network Frontier's Unified Compliance Framework. The Unified Compliance Framework is basically a service that Network Frontiers came up with that provides a test once, comply many model for compliance. We're going to go over and look at the UCF as part of the demo later, but basically what happens is if you have 50 different regulatory bodies, I don't want to have to do 50 different controls just because each one is slightly different. The Unified Compliance Framework basically gets approval from these regulatory bodies to review their controls and come up with one aggregate control that meets all of the requirements for each of those bodies. So it's 50 regulatory bodies, 50 citations, which is the definition of the control, and one control that then allows you to test for all 50. The UCF is an integration that ServiceNow provides, and it does require a separate subscription. You have to have an actual account. It's between $5,000 and $10,000 a year, depending upon your level of usage. But using that allows you to download all of the regulatory sources, all of the citations, all of the control templates, basically, and get to that test once, comply many model. So what do we do with P&C? And we're going back to the graphic that we looked at earlier. The upfront configuration with policy and compliance, we're looking at the authority documentation, and that's where we're talking about the internal and external regulatory sources, the authority documents. So the IRS 1075 for how finances should be run at a business is an authority document. Each section that provides testable content in that document is a citation. Those are what we map to our internal policies. And policy management and policy acknowledgement is how we manage those. We come up with the control that allows us to test compliance, and that's our control objective. It's a template at the enterprise level that shows how we as an enterprise are doing compliance-wise. Those compliance templates, the control objectives, allows us to create indicator templates. And indicator templates is part of the automation behind the scenes. It allows us to create test templates because, frankly, compliance only deals with, are you complying with the process? Is your process compliant with the actual requirements that are in place? We do that by, again, going back to the hub of an entity type, and we find the entities that are relevant. We assign the control objectives to that. The automation automatically creates controls, one control per control objective per entity. Meaning that, again, if I have 50 authority documents and 50 control objectives, one per, and 50 entities, I will have a control per entity that matches each of those control objectives. We also attest to the compliance of that control or not. Compliance is a yes or no. Do we comply or don't we? And if we don't, why and what will it take to get us there? A lot of companies like to come at compliance with an aspect of, well, yes, but there's levels of compliance, not from the regulatory body's standpoint. If you have a client and they say, but we want to measure the level of compliance, you can absolutely do that. There's ways to do that without changing the compliance structure. Because frankly, and anybody who has done taxes knows this, if the IRS says, are you doing your taxes right? And you say yes, they have the ability to tell that. And if they come back to you and say, well, no, it doesn't matter that you are 90% there, you're still wrong. When it comes to security compliance, talking about the NIST 853 CSF and the top 20 security controls, you're either complying with those controls or you're not complying with them. The level of compliance doesn't matter to them. Measuring compliance internally, measuring the level of compliance, is much like what we do in projects when it comes to stories. It's a great thing to be able to measure velocity as someone working stories and measure how well you're doing and how quickly you're ramping up the ability to complete stories. But either the story is done or it's not done on time from a project standpoint. The same thing is true within policy and compliance. It's great to measure effectiveness and your level of compliance, maturity of compliance, but you're still either compliant or not compliant. Now, the automation behind the scenes is going to take the indicator templates that we create and assign to objectives, and the test templates that are created, and the relationship of control objective to entity type, and the attestations that are created for each control objective, and it will generate for us the indicators, the test plans, the controls, and the attestations necessary. And it will do that on a regular basis as the source data changes. The thing to keep in mind is that if you change the way ServiceNow works from a compliance standpoint for relationships between these fundamental functional templates, the control objective, the test template, the indicator template, etc., you run the risk of breaking the automation behind the scenes that is meant to get your compliance admins out of manual operational compliance monitoring and get them to an oversight level. Because operationally, you want the system to do the indicator monitoring. You want the system to automatically generate controls. You want it to automatically generate attestations at a certain frequency. You want it to automatically generate issues if non-compliance is found to be the case. There is a relationship, and you can see this as kind of grayed out section that's risk. There's a relationship to risk because compliance mitigates risk. And if you tie the two together, that's where, as we talked about a couple weeks ago, the daily risk can be seen as matching or not matching the target residual risk. If you didn't, I encourage you to go through the risk management demo that we did a couple of weeks ago for more of an explanation there. But while you do not need to run policy and compliance and risk at the same time together, linked together, you can run them separately. It works a whole lot better for the enterprise if you do link them. Now, opposed from risk, policy and compliance directly impacts audit. And we're not going through audit today. We may do so in the future. But internal audit is normally an IT function that looks at two things. Are the controls that you're running designed well, and are they effective from an operational standpoint? The audit engagement is designed specifically to allow you to do selective testing of the controls that are monitored from a compliance standpoint and look at them from both of those standpoints, design effectiveness and operational effectiveness. A lot of clients will tell you, well, we only want to worry about operational effectiveness, and that's fine. The design effectiveness can be made optional. But from a true IT audit standpoint, a good auditor will look at both sides of that. When you look at your controls, are they designed well? Are they easily implemented and easily followed? Then they will look at the operational effectiveness. When people actually daily run through their business processes, are your controls effective at mitigating risk and maintaining compliance in those processes? So that's where policy and compliance directly impacts audit and supports it from an internal IT audit standpoint for control review. Now, I've mentioned IT audit more than once, but overall, GRC is not IT specific. It was originally started as that. It started out as IT GRC. It's no longer that. It is simply governance, risk, and compliance. And in Paris, the next version, you're going to see that change to be called IRM, Integrated Risk Management. And the overall concept from governance, risk, and compliance will switch to integrated risk management because frankly, policy and compliance is simply a gigantic self-integrating, self-contained module that supports the mitigation of risk. That's really all that it is. Let's talk about compliance management, and basically we have three different steps. When it comes to compliance management, we need to document the requirements first of all. So we're going to these external regulatory bodies and we're getting their rules and regulations, and we're going to industry organizations and getting their best practices, and we're compiling those lists. That's where the UCF comes into play because they do it for us. Next, we obtain the perspective of the process owners and operators as to how we actually comply, how well we comply with those regulations. And we do that via the controls that are in place. Do we do X? If we don't do X, then we have to remediate. And we do that through remediation tasks. If a business process control is found to be non-compliant, it will generate an issue automatically. That issue then becomes the hub of remediation tasks. It gives us visibility. And as the control owner, I can then see all of the different pieces that need to be done. It could be very simple. It could be where the application development team has to go change a setting or run a patch. It could be fairly complex and have multiple remediation points. If the issue involves access to an application over the internet, I may need the app dev team, the network engineering team, the server engineering team, all to get involved. You can document a technical plan of action and mitigation, a POAM. That's a federal government acronym, but you can document that using the remediation task structure with dependent tasks and a timeline and different assignment groups, and you can get as technical as need be. The issue is the fact that we're not compliant. The remediation tasks are what we're going to do to fix that non-compliance. Now, how do we evaluate compliance? As we talked about the attestation earlier, it's very subjective. And there's two ways for compliance to be evaluated. Subjectively, in that I'm asking someone with direct knowledge of a business process whether they think we're compliant or not. Now, if they say yes, I am also going to ask them to give me evidence of that, but that doesn't technically qualify as objective proof. The fact that I am getting someone else's perspective and asking them to give me information is not objective. It's still subjective from a compliance standpoint. The objective side of the house is the indicator. And an indicator can be something as simple as a task to provide data from an external source, or as complex as a query to several ServiceNow tables to identify correlating data that proves compliance. Now, give you an example of a complex indicator. I don't like indicator tasks. They're simply asking people to give you data, and if you're going to do that to show compliance, you might as well stay with the attestation survey and not worry about the indicator. An indicator query can be built extremely complexly. So to give you an example, there was a bank that I worked with a couple of years ago that had consistent problems with issues and problems being generated after changes were implemented in production. They suspected that the problem was people working on changes and applying changes in production environments before the proper evaluation and approval had been done. Now, the key to remember here is that it has to be in ServiceNow. The business process and the supporting data all has to be inside ServiceNow because I can't query an external source with an indicator. But fortunately, if you run change management inside of ServiceNow, then you're going to have three different tables involved: the change record, the change task, and the change approval. By creating complex queries and joins, what we were able to discover was at the norm, fully 1/3 of changes over a 6-month time frame, every month, 1/3 of the changes that were closed, the change task was begun and completed before all approvals had been given. So people were jumping the gun, running changes in production instances without proper approvals. Proper approvals which probably would have identified issues that needed to be addressed prior to the change being run. So again, using queries to search through tables and using code to identify complex joins of records for both percentile and true-false relationships. Do we do this? How much do we do this? How often do we do this? To what percent do we do this? Those are the objective indicators. The data is in ServiceNow and the data doesn't lie. We always want to use an objective indicator if possible, but normally from a project standpoint, that is not an option the first time we go through GRC. We have to get people used to the instance, used to policy compliance as a concept, used to owning controls and running attestations. Indicators are normally a phase 2 or even a phase 3 part of a process. Now, how do we respond to non-compliance? We talked about this a little while ago. If ServiceNow sees a control that is non-compliant, it will automatically create an issue. That issue has two different responses. You can either accept the fact that it's non-compliant, and if it's accepted, ServiceNow would expect that a policy exception record be created. Now, it doesn't manually do that because normally you would use a record producer in the service catalog to submit that. But I have seen clients actually automate that if you click accept on an issue, it automatically creates a stub policy exception for you to then complete and submit into the system. For mitigation or remediation, a remediation task is expected to be created. Same thing where it does not do it for you, but I've seen a lot of clients automate the creation of a stub remediation task. so that it's there and ready to be completed and submitted if you're going to remediate. Either way, at either the completion of the remediation task or the expiration of the policy exception, the failed control has to be reevaluated to prove that compliance has been attained. Okay, so that's out of the box functionality. We talked about policy management earlier, and policy management is a separate piece that correlates to the rest of GRC. It can be run by itself. It can also be completely ignored. Policy management is the internal creation, publishing, and management of internal policies. So I have my external regulatory sources, my internal perspectives, and I can manage that process inside of policy management in GRC. Now, it's very, very similar, almost identical to knowledge management. There is an article record called a policy. It looks identical to a knowledge article. The policy management process of review and approval over time with automatic valid to reversion to review process is identical to knowledge. The difference is that policies can be created, published, managed, reviewed, updated, and taken through that cycle as many times as need be. But each time a policy is published, a knowledge article is created and retired and a new one created for each published cycle. And there is a GRC knowledge base that those are put into. Policy acknowledgement goes one step further. And it's the concept of I'm not only going to create my policies, I'm going to basically campaign across the enterprise for people to acknowledge that they understand it. When you create a campaign, you can identify the relevant individuals and say, well, this department needs to acknowledge that they understand this policy. If your policies are based on NIST or CSF for security, then you might want to create a campaign for the policies for network engineering, but not necessarily HR. If you have HR policies around employee behavior, you can create a campaign for the entire organization so that everybody acknowledges their understanding of an HR policy. This can all be done inside of policy management and policy acknowledgement, and it doesn't matter that it's IT related or not. All right, we mentioned earlier where policy compliance does expand into audit. When you attest to a control in compliance management, you're simply saying whether you comply with the control or not. How well the control is designed or how effective it is not being addressed. Design and operational effectiveness is a function of maturity. And this is where we talked about the level of maturity or the level of compliance. And audit allows you to gauge that level of compliance for your controls. What do you need to add? What do you need to change? Or what do you need to remove to make the design of the controls more effective, easier to understand, easier to comply with? What do you need to change in your business processes to make your level of maturity and understanding of the controls greater? Your operational effectiveness. The control affects operational business practices better because you have a better understanding of it. That directly correlates with perceived compliance. And again, the ineffective control test will automatically create an issue that has to be remediated for the control in question. That's as much as we're going to get into audit because it is its own module, and there are very few people who run all three as compared to those who run risk and policy and compliance by themselves. Let's go ahead and go into a demo. And we have our demo 15, as I mentioned before. If you want to get access to it and look at policy compliance from a technical standpoint, you can. This is the compliance overview, and it is basically looking at the compliance at the enterprise level according to the different authority documents and controls that are in place. You notice we have 4,968 control objectives, citations that are being tested. You can break that down by authority document, and you can say, well, here's the security and privacy. Here's ISO 27001-2013. Here's the top 20 critical security controls, PCI DSS, the payment card industry that controls credit card transactions. Here's COBIT, FedRAMP, etc. All of this is broken down and provided because of the relationship between a single control up the chain to multiple citations to multiple authority documents. So let's look at that real quick. And I'm going to go to my authority documents, and I see that we have several of them here. I'm going to pull up the CSIS Top 20 Critical Security Controls. This is a best practice guideline, and as you can see, as an authority document, it is simply a piece of documentation. Simple record with information. You'll notice that it is coming from the UCF, Unified Compliance Framework, and each of the sections is a citation. These are simple sections, paragraphs that contain testable material. The system must notify security personnel inside 24 hours if an account is added to a super user. Now, this has a one-to-one relationship. This citation has one control. The control is basically you need to have your log send alerts for each auditable event, success, or failure. Doesn't sound the same. But the CSIS has agreed that complying with this control, this technical control, means that you're complying with this citation, this portion of their regulatory standard. If we look at this control objective, this is the template. This is the definition of the technical control, and this is what creates the control for each entity. We have our categorization. We have a checkbox that says creates controls automatically. No controls will be created unless this is checked. But if you'll notice, this single point of testing, this control objective is related to 5 different citations. It's related to control metric 12.11 and control metric 12, the parent from the CSIS Top 20, but it's also related to the NIST 853 high impact baseline. So it's AU5. So high impact, we have a couple of different versions here that have come in over time. And when you look at these versions, it could be nothing more than somebody switched from an A to an AN or from the to an A. It's simple verbiage changes that cause this type of duplication. But this would be a 1-to-2 matching. One control objective proving compliance to 2 different authority documents. Now, you notice this doesn't have any controls because it's not related to an entity type. We talked about entity types to begin with in our first session, and the entity type is simply the idea of the hub that allows us to identify entities or records in ServiceNow that match with the controls in place. The business processes for our controls apply to those entities. And in this case, let's say it's servers. So every Windows server should have a log configured to send alerts for auditable events, success, or failure. We're going to save this. And then we're going to check this because the system knows I'm not going to create controls because this isn't checked. I'm going to do a quick save. And now I'm going to say, oh, I don't have to do anything. The system is automatically doing it for me. This is what I talked about with the automation behind the scenes. The system sees changes. It sees them in controls. It sees them in entity types. It sees them in the list of entities and the relationships between them all. And the automation kicks in almost automatically in the next second or two. Now, it's also going to do it every single night. So if source data changes in our target table of entities, then the next morning you could wake up with a bunch of different entities and controls all having been created automatically. I'm going to check the progress real quick, and we can see that it is actually 100% done. So I'm going to do a quick, I got to refresh, and now I have 52 different controls related to 52 different entities. These are my Windows servers. And now what I need to do is make sure that the owners of those controls, the people who own those servers, realize that they are responsible for being compliant with this control. So let's look at that real quick. I have my control. It is in a draft state, and it is pretty much a duplicate. The category, the type, the classification is the same. Enforcement is an optional way to say these are voluntary versus mandated by federal requirement. Many clients use mandated for regulatory, like legal regulations that carry the weight of law, versus voluntary being an industry standard that may or may not apply specifically to your enterprise that you're going to go ahead and follow. The owner has the ability to look at who's going to attest to the compliance. And of course, this can be multiple people. So I'm going to go ahead and set myself as the compliance person. And then I'm going to notice that, you know what, there is no attestation. This is where the cascade of data occurs between the two. I'm going to go up to the control objective, open the record, and I'm going to choose the attestation. And it's a simple GRC attestation. I'm going to update this. And now every single control will use the same attestation. You build the attestation once, it's then applicable to every control. We'll attest this, and you'll see that it's going to go to the attest state. One attestation has been created, and I'm going to go take that attestation. This uses right now the standard assessment engine function to create surveys. It does assume that the individual you're sending the attestation to understands two things: the entity in question and the control that needs to be complied with. The entity is my Windows server, and the question is, do I configure the log to send alerts for each auditable event, success or failure? When you think of risk management is always a negative statement, while policy compliance management is always a positive statement. We do configure the logs. Do I? Yes, I do. From a risk standpoint, it's we don't configure the logs, and here's the risk of not doing that. That's where the mitigation and the compliance aspect of a control directly impacts the risk for the same entity. I'm going to say that it's not applicable. I have to say why, of course, but I can submit this into the system and it will mark the control not applicable. Now, once that's verified, there's a checkbox that you may have noticed called exempt. Exempt means you don't need to attest to this next time. Even though the system may see that there's an annual attestation that's due, you're exempt from it. You don't have to redo it, and the system will not automatically redo the attestation on a regular basis. That's what not applicable is for. If I say yes, it's going to require me to attach evidence, and this follows the standard rules for what cannot be attached and the size of the document, but we would expect a system log or a screenshot of a setting from the system that shows that that configuration is in place. Not just, yes, I do it, but because we're basing this on someone's yes or no perspective, regardless of the evidence, it's still considered a subjective answer. I'm going to say no, and no means for this server, we don't comply for some reason or whatever. And I have to explain, and I'm going to go ahead and submit this. That's great. I've completed the attestation. I'm going to go back to my control. Now you'll note that the control has been stipulated as non-compliant. There's no level of compliance. There's no question around maturity or the design effectiveness or operational effectiveness. You simply don't do it, so you're not compliant. It's in the review state, and it's going to stay in the review state because we now have an issue automatically created for me. The issue is assigned to the owner of the control, so I've given the owner my perspective. The issue goes to her, and it's for this configuration item. We have a control attestation failure, and it's that we don't configure the log. So I technically have as much information in this one record to then define my either remediation plan or my exception. And that's where it comes to go to, we can analyze it and then respond to it. And the response is remediate the problem, fix it, or accept. As I said, these are simple documentations of our response. They don't have any automation behind them. And that's a common ask is, can we automate the creation of an exception if I'm going to hit accept, or a remediation task if I hit remediate? And yes, you can do that. Now, having done that, if the remediation task is completed or the exception expires and we say it's fixed, the issue will go into the review state. And if the issue is closed, the control, which you can see here, moves from the review back to the attest, and I have to then prove that, yes, I am actually compliant now that the issue has been addressed, or the exception has been addressed by resolving it. You can extend exceptions, you can keep exceptions going to cover the time frame for fixing issues. And normally what I tell clients is that if you're going to remediate, if it's going to be longer than a month, go ahead and have your people put exceptions in to document the fact that during that month, you're not in compliance and you know you're not in compliance, and being out of compliance is approved. There's no approval for accepting an issue. That's where policy exception comes into play, approving being out of compliance. Now, let's go ahead and look at that from a standpoint of policy exception. And policy exception can be proactive or retroactive. Normally, people do not realize they're out of compliance until an issue appears. And that's where I can go in, address the issue, and submit the exception, which does a direct correlation. If you get to the point where you are pushing policies out to the enterprise and using policy management and policy exception, that's where you can go from being reactive to non-compliance to proactive and simply submit it based on a policy that you've read. So if I have acknowledged that I understand the remote access control policy and I know I can't comply with it, I can come in and submit an exception simply based on my understanding of the policy. No testing has been done. There's no relationship to a control. There's no relationship to an issue. It's simply I'm reacting to a policy and being proactive and saying, I can't comply with this. This allows me to really jump the gun and get ahead of testing that could be done in the actual future. There is the ability to include risk in the concept of the exception, because exceptions do acknowledge that you are approving non-compliance, which impacts risk. And I can ask risk management to give me their impression or their perspective, give me the rating that they feel this exception will have, so that I can then decide, do I reject or approve the exception? Do I reject or approve remaining non-compliant? If you reject, then yeah, you better fix it, and you better fix it fast. Put a remediation task out and fix the problem. If I accept it, well, then it just kind of hangs around. There's an accepted issue with an exception in place. There is a time frame under which it is valid to. And until that valid to hits, everything's kosher because I've documented everything, because I want to get the documentation in place so that when audit comes around, yes, we know we have a problem and we are addressing it. And here's the exception and the approval and the understanding of what that problem could create for us. We understand, we know, we're dealing with it. Putting the documentation in place is paramount to having happy auditors and happy executives. That's compliance. And then there's policy management. And policy management, of course, as we talked about, is the idea of a policy in the system. And as we mentioned here, policies are the internal side of the house. We have a policy about how we do things, and that policy has been reviewed, and it has an approval, and it's published. And in this case, I have an acknowledgement campaign that I'm pushing out to my end users, and nobody's answered yet. I understand that. It takes time. I just did it 2 days ago. But in this case, I have an entity type, the hub, that specific records have to be tested for compliance. Do my vendors have a remote access control policy? They should. And I can test my vendors according to the policy I have in place and see how well they comply with that. Or do they have a policy that mitigates the risk that I might see, that they can say, I don't comply with yours, I do comply with mine. And you can have an exception that says, we do acknowledge that the entity, the vendor in this case, has a policy. It is not ours. That's fine. It's okay. But because our policy is non-compliant, we should have an exception. We can also tell that there are 7 different controls, control objectives that support this policy. So the remote control access policy can be supported with multiple controls. Maintaining remote access and teleworking. We do that or we don't. Do we control remote access through network access protocols? Yes or no. Do we protect remote access accounts with encryption? Yes or no. The level of compliance, which as you can see over here, we are 98% compliant across our entities to this one, but 100% off of this one. This aggregate is what allows us to look at compliance scores across the board. We talked about the enterprise versus entity level. We want to show the enterprise that as a company, we are compliant, but we want to be able to get down to each specific asset, the hard assets like servers and facilities, data centers, versus vendors, versus departments, versus people, versus processes, and prove compliance not only at the granular level, but up the chain to the enterprise at the policy, at the authority document level. And as long as the relationships are in place to entity type, to control objective, those will all automatically aggregate compliance up the chain. The policy campaign is pretty simple. It's the acknowledgement of we are publishing a policy. We are basically creating a group of people. So we have an audience, and in this case, it's the security team, and the audience could be a bunch of different things. It could be the entire enterprise. But we are pushing out acknowledgments and asking people to, do you understand this? Do you acknowledge this policy is in place? Do you understand the policy? Yes or no? This policy campaign is valid until November, so there's time. But again, of course, as demo data, I don't have any response yet from people to this policy. But this is an ask, actually, as an enhancement to policy and compliance. This is an ask from multiple clients who really want to get away from things like SurveyMonkey. If I have an HR policy, why shouldn't I be able to put that in ServiceNow, push notifications to my entire business, get everybody's response into the system, be able to report on that into my system of record, and then be able to run compliance against it to show how compliant we are as a group? That's what ServiceNow does. You might as well use it for all your policies, not just IT-related ones. So that's policy and compliance, policy acknowledgement, policy exception. And then, of course, scoping is the concept we talked about fundamentally as a foundation for all GRC. It's the entities. It's the records in the system that present risk and need to be maintained and monitored for compliance. The controls are the actual records where we do our testing, the attestations, the testing, the subjective perspective on whether we're compliant or not, our issues of non-compliance that need to be addressed. The indicators are those queries in the system that we want to make objective. And then the remediation task is how we are going to address the problems that arise. The administration section is basically all of the different options. And we talked about as a process admin, not a ServiceNow admin, but as a process admin, I can change the choices that appear on some of my records, the choices for classification and type, the choices for the type of policy. These are just everything that I, as an admin of the process, should be able to adjust and add to in production. We always caution people, while you have the ability, stick with standard change processes, do the work in a subprod and validate it, and either have it moved during a change or log the change to do the work in production so that you know a change has been made. The attestation types, the GRC attestation using the actual attestation designer, the same attestation designer that surveys are built with, that the attestation, if I look at this and we load it into the system, it's that simple, exact same questions. It's this, the GRC admins are meant to adjust in production. Again, standard change caveat applies. There's a lot of different options in here that we don't deal with to begin with. There's methods of categorization and classification that are additional that usually we get into just as a phase 2. Let's get things in the system and now let's go further in categorization and classification. But this is the basics of policy and compliance with policy exception, policy management, compliance management, and policy acknowledgement all built into it. Thank you very much for the opportunity, for your attention today. It's really appreciated.